And I'm very happy about that because we invited many of the best entrepreneurs, innovators, ecosystem players of Hungary. Many of them actually have multiple roles who will represented in the stage. So let me ask Jentetics Kinga from Publishdrive, Fehér Gyula from IBM, Ustream, British Budapest. Give a big hand to our guests. Bálint Orosz from A3 Ventures and Scanner earlier, and Balogh Péter from Baconsult and NNG earlier. So a lot of our players had multiple roles. And last but not least, go to the stage Csongor Biás, who will lead this conversation.
Welcome. First of all, thank you so much for accepting this invitation to this panel. I'm super excited. Well, now we have most of the Hungarian role models and startup heroes on stage. First of all, I would like to ask you to do a very quick introduction and tell you what are you most busy with and what is your relation these days with the startup ecosystem?
Hi, I'm Peter Balogh. I'm a successful exited entrepreneur, I would say. And lately I'm an angel investor with around 30 investments in my portfolio. I spend most of my time talking to startup founders.
Hi, I'm Bálint. I'm the fish between the two sharks. Essentially, I founded a company called Distinction, which was acquired by Skyscanner, where I oversaw product development. And since I exited the job, I'm looking at how to best help the Hungarian startup ecosystem.
I'm Gyula Fehér. I was the founder of a company called Ustream, which got acquired by IBM. And as of yesterday, I'm officially partner in a venture capital investment firm called Octagon Ventures.
Hey everyone, my name is Kinga Jentetics from Publishdrive. And Publishdrive is a startup. We have more than 17 people, both in the States and both here in Budapest as well. So we are basically in the ecosystem where we actually are connecting to all the people who actually we can work with. And we actually try to be part of all the ecosystem in the US as well, like through Google Launchpad, for instance, where we were accelerated as well. And we were actually part of the Startup Wise Guys program also in Estonia, so we've seen the Estonian ecosystem also.
Hi. Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Gyula Szopa. I run Startup Poland, as you probably know from the previous presentation. I'm basically a philosopher turned a logician, turned entrepreneur, turned a tech lobbyist. Before I started at Startup Poland, I also had my own company selling bras made in Central Eastern Europe to the women in Canada and the US. Before that, I was a program director at Blackbox in Palo Alto, a startup acceleration firm. And before that, I ran a couple of community jobs at startups in Poland.
Thank you. So if you look at startups and we talk about successful startups, we kind of have a blueprint. We need a stellar team, a good product, a big market, and many other things. But if you look at the wider perspective and we talk about startup ecosystem, what do you think, what are the prerequisites and the characteristics of a healthy ecosystem? And that's an open question. Please feel free to grab.
It's just a lot, right? I mean, I think when I started my previous company, NNG, we didn't actually have an ecosystem around us, so it was like we didn't have access to funds. We didn't know we were a startup to begin with. So it was very different times. What I see is that it's a lot easier to start these days. There's a lot more access to capital. What I think is one of the biggest problems in the Hungarian ecosystem right now is that there's a lot more capital than experience with capital. So yeah, it's a huge question, so I'll let the others answer it.
The other thing I'd add, I think, is what you really need as a startup is distribution or capability to distribute your product. And I think Hungary, whatever kind of ecosystem we build here, is going to be incapable of providing you with adequate distribution. Like even if I look at Poland, the market size, I assume like spending and things like that, 5/10 the time of what Hungary is, probably because of those. But if you just think about, you say it's not a magnitude bigger, but if you think about DAC and House maybe, where Hungary, 3-person team can make their money from the local distribution, versus even in Poland, not going globally, that could be a 15-person company. Now, a 15-person company can be. And I think that is one of the crux in Hungary of you do have to think global from day one, because the Hungarian market it will give you a really good lifestyle business. As you said that in Poland, many people got stuck in there, but probably not get you to the startup scale of what we're looking at.
I mean, we say you need to think globally, but when I look at it, a lot of startups are not thinking globally. They think, I will make my product successful in the Hungarian market, and then I will expand to Slovakia, and I will be in the US in 15 years probably. It's just not the way it works. I think the biggest thing that's missing is the mindset of successful entrepreneurship, that certain killer instinct that makes people want to enter big markets from day one, and it makes them behave like leaders in that market. And they approach customers, they approach partners, they approach the right venture capital firms, and they just make it happen. And it scares me when I see that most of the exits that we had were actually from the era where we did not have an ecosystem and we did not have enough funding. I mean, what's the learning from that? Does it mean that it's actually detrimental? I hope not, but I think we need to catch up.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. That today entrepreneurship means in many people's mindset that we have to fundraise first. We have to, and then we are basically living from the venture capitalist money, and then we will build a team and so on, which might come at some point, I think. But first of all, and that's what I said today in the presentation as well, that you have to think and you have to create value for your customers, and you have to create some kind of product, even if it is not the final product, because obviously it's always evolving. But at least you have to find 1 or 2 people in the beginning, and you have to stalk them in many ways to actually sell something to them, and they will be willing to pay money for the product what you created. And I think when you have that kind of passion, and when you are brave enough to do that, because many people are just, I'm coding, I will build the product, and when it's ready, then I will release it, I will show it to a customer, and it's not really working in that way, because then you can get into so many mistakes what you will build your whole product upon, or so many bad insights because you haven't talked to your customers first. And I think that's a mindset what we have to change as well.
I'm going to move back a little bit to your original question about the ecosystem, not just the startup founders. So I would say what makes a startup ecosystem healthy, there are 3 things. So first is the definition of done. So the people here, the players on the scene, have to define when are we going to be happy with the state of the ecosystem, right? Like in Poland, there's this massive pressure to breed a unicorn. So every interview the prime minister or whatever from the government gives is the unicorn is what we are striving for. So the definition of done. Number 2 is the data. So as in a startup, if you want to see if you are growing, you need to collect your, you hook up your Google Analytics, right? You hook up many different metric systems to see if you are getting more revenue, if your user base is growing. The same applies to the ecosystem. Are we growing? What does it mean? Does it mean that we have more startup founders? Or does it mean that we have bigger valuations? Or does it mean that we have more money available? Although you're saying that money is bad, so that's kind of... But you need to define the metrics that define your ecosystem and track these metrics. So harvest the data on the regular basis, annually, maybe quarterly. And the third thing is the role models. So the ecosystem is not going to evolve and develop towards that definition of done, towards the healthy one, if there are no people who are very visible, shining on Forbes cover, like Gyula here, showing that they've done it, they managed to do this, how they struggled, what they achieved, and so on. So to sum up, the definition of done, the data, and the role models, I think, are the three key things that the healthy startup ecosystem needs.
Thank you. I'd like to stop in the previous insight and dig deeper a little bit. So you, as the first generation of successful entrepreneurs, built up your businesses and success stories even before the ecosystem was born. Kinga is representing a new generation of startups, a very thriving one. You went to an Estonian accelerator, whereas there was already a lot of accelerators here, and you today spend a lot of time in other environments. Can you tell me, first of all, why did you choose an Estonian accelerator? And second, can you make a little comparison about other ecosystems that you usually visit these days? What are the biggest differences?
Yeah, so it was a very concise decision not to stay in Hungary, but to actually open our eyes and basically learn from others what they are doing outside of our comfort zone. Because obviously when it's about Estonian startup world, everyone knows that they actually are some kind of leaders in the whole in Europe. That's for sure, because they are sharing their knowledge with other new companies and new startups. They actually have a very strong angel investor ecosystem as well, and they are really willing to give back to the community. And I think that's really important if there should be an ecosystem built anywhere in the world. And I have a lot of friends in San Francisco as well, a lot of startups who actually are from there. And we always share ideas because obviously they are in different stages, in different environment, but they make quite the same mistakes as well. So we can learn from each other. And I think that's really important to have good founder relationships, not just in Hungary, but outside of Hungary as well, to learn from other companies who actually are maybe serving other markets as well, and then just to understand how they are actually doing their everyday business. And obviously to meet other mentors, because that's a crucial part also, who are actually advisors, who actually have seen a lot of other startups who were failing and who, or even who made it, and then learn from them as well. And obviously everyone can give advice. It's up to the founders whether they are willing to act upon those advices. And then when it's about ecosystem, I think that first of all, like other founders, then mentors, and obviously VCs or other financial advisors or financial institutions. As I mentioned, I think, and others as well in this panel, currently there is a lot of money here in Hungary. And when we go to San Francisco, there's a lot of money there as well. But it's different how they are using that money. And it's different what founders are looking in the money as well, because I think, especially when you are starting out, you don't have to have the money first, you have to have the knowledge first.
Great. Let's talk about money a little bit more, and maybe I would like to ask you, three of you gentlemen, to elaborate a little bit on your journey from becoming an entrepreneur to an investor, and maybe elaborate a little bit about this giving back mechanism which was driving so many ecosystems and
Yeah, what I'm really happy about is that many of the exited previous generation startups or who have built a company are now getting back into the ecosystem as investors. Yeah, there's three of us like that, but there are a lot more of these guys now and girls now in Hungary. And I think that's extremely important from an ecosystem point of view, because it's not money. Money is abundant. There's just way too much money the EU pours on Hungary or the region. But what's more important is experience and connections. And I think this is building up the level of experience that goes back into new companies. And I find that that's the most valuable thing that can happen to them. Yes, what you see as exits right now is the exits of those guys 10 years ago, 15 years ago, who didn't have access to any of this ecosystem nonsense. But what I'm also seeing is that there are now a few dozens of startups that I'm tracking, and some of them are in my portfolio, who are going to be as big as our companies were. So what I'm seeing is that there's a huge next wave coming. And yeah, there's been a bit of time between these waves. So it was, self-made startups, and now startups with access to capital and know-how and talking to each other and sharing ideas. Very new concepts, if you ask me.
I agree with everything you said. I think one thing the ecosystem would need more is probably more exits, because that's when somebody can really think about more of how not just to work every day on their own business, but help the ecosystem. After we left Skyscanner, we're also just looking around, what did we need inside of the ecosystem, what was missing, and what can we provide. And we've been talking with startups of what do they need. It quickly turned out that the money we can give is so tiny compared to the money they can get that's not something they need. It's probably more of they can have somebody they ask questions they've seen, who's seen things before, and these are very basic questions from, if I have a term sheet, can I negotiate? If I need to depart with a co-founder, what can I do? How do I decide if a product is going to run on the market or not? Some of these questions can be researched online. Some of these are very hard, and also the Hungarian legal structures might make it really different than what you might read. But overall, what I was missing at the time is really somebody who's seen it and I ask it. Like I always bring up the thing when we got our acquisition offer, I didn't know if you are allowed to negotiate in these things. And I didn't want to look like a Hungarian guy who, wants to, take every cent on the coin. So we didn't negotiate. And, looking in retrospective, we went through from the other side on our process and you saw, yeah, you actually do negotiate. And just simple things like that can make a big difference. So our drive when going to this is, can we provide this help? It actually turns out that a lot less people actually want this help. A lot more people just want to hear that, oh, you're awesome and you can do it and here's the money. But I mean, that's fine as well, I think.
I think an investor can contribute three things: money, know-how, and network. And I think we have the first one covered in Hungary, although a lot of it is public funds with some administration and other overhead attached. But know-how and network, I think we can still improve on. And I think we are starting to see the first wave of founders turned investors. And in some cases, it may be important, but because it's different to have an investor who comes from a corporate or maybe private equity background and maybe good with balance sheets. But the thing is, a startup is it's a newborn. It has very fluid structures, very fluid strategy. Everything can change overnight. It's not like any major business out there, except maybe for growth stage, which we don't really have. And I think someone who had seen this and experienced this firsthand can have insights and perspective that can save a lot of time. At the same time, as an ex-founder, you need to be cautious, because just because you experience something and solve something a certain way doesn't mean that every similar issue needs the same solution. So it's kind of like retired football players becoming coaches. And some great football players become great coaches. And then there is Lothar Matthäus. So you need to be very mindful of the differences of the game. You're not a player anymore, you're a coach. And that's different. It's not enough for you to know how to kick the ball. You actually need to be able to help the other person who is actually on the field to know how to kick the ball in a certain situation. And that means supporting versus commanding. It's different.
So the fundraising environment is fairly similar in Poland than in Hungary if we talk about the ratio or balance or imbalance between public and private sources. Could you highlight the characteristics and some of the potential drawbacks that comes with this?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we measured the venture capital scene last year, we found out that 81% of all financing rounds throughout the last decade was done with some public money. And we're estimating that the whole amount pumped from the EU, and the public money means European Union funds, of course. And I think in total there was around 700 million euro pumped into startups, the new technology companies in Poland, through multiple state agencies like the National Center for Research and Development, the Polish Development Fund, the National, all kinds of development agencies. And this, of course, changes the mechanics of the venture game because most of these money are given, equity-free as grants, and they are given in Poland to venture capital funds so that they get a leverage to invest. So, for instance, and the proportion most often is 20 to 80. So, as a private investor, you come up with, say, 20,000, 200,000, and the state gives you 800,000. So this is a very lucrative and sweet deal for any venture capitalist who wants to use some public money. But this also means that for the VC of that provenance, the incentive to grow the company is much smaller than for the founder, because for him or her, it's enough to exit at the valuation, say, 20, 30% higher than the entry valuation, rather than growing this 10 times or 100 times, right? Because the thing here is to get the cash back from the grant. So this has changed mechanics in a way that the ambitions of venture capitalists fueled with the state grants are not aligned with the ambitions of startup founders. And, as you spoke before, our region has this problem with low ambitions and growing until the lifestyle business, not growing higher, not playing the game longer, and counting on longer perspective returns. So that was kind of detrimental to the development of venture capital firms and startups funded by them. Although this doesn't mean that it's very bad, because I would risk a hypothesis that hadn't we had all these European Union funds to breed the new generation of VC fund managers and to stimulate the creation of new companies, also, making young people, or not so young people, but first-time founders, the CEOs of new companies, there would be no venture capital scene and no startup scene in Poland right now. So I think it was crucial to have all these mechanisms, of course, with all the bad and all the good. I think that at the end of the day, the result is heartwarming and spirit-lifting, because we see, as you also said, you see in Hungary, we have more and more funds established by serial entrepreneurs or startup founders who have a very different perspective than investment bankers or private equity fund managers or the government clerks. And I think that at least what startups are saying, the most efficient and the highest rated venture capital managers in Poland are the ones who have GPs, the general partners, coming both from startups, so startup founders who exited, and having some investment bankers who understand the number crunching and Excels and spreadsheets and so on. Because you need the mix of two skill sets to be able to grow or breed the portfolio of company. Because as you said before, it's not about playing the game again, but through other people's hands. But it's coaching the new companies. It's breeding, say, a portfolio of 20, 30, or even 100 new startups. So you need cross or complementary skill sets to do this.
So the figure is fairly similar in Hungary. You mentioned 800 million just in the last 4 years. In Hungary, there was over €1 billion.
For us, it was since 2014. So
yeah, and we are not talking about the previous round of Jeremy's and a lot of other similar sources in the past. Why don't we see more successes? Petya, you said they are coming. Do you agree that there are a lot of companies that are coming from these investments and coming to be successful? Or why don't we see existing?
It's very interesting to do the number crunching, right? So we're saying that there has been $1 billion going into funds which say they invested in startups, right? So I think that's the first of numbers and A/B tests can be, as misleading as you want them. And in this case, I think the actual startup investing where funds started putting, rather than trying to work on let's put it in a factory, because if a factory sells for the same amount of price, I get 5 times the value. I think those investments are starting to happen now. So I wouldn't compare those areas instead. In terms of new startups, I agree with Peter in the sense that I also see a couple of startups, not many of them, who definitely have the potential, have a very good market environment, have a kick-ass funding team, who do have any chance to outgrow any Hungarian startup we've seen before. Now, will that happen? We don't know, but it's not like hundreds of them. I'd more like you can count them in 2 of your hands. But there are, I think, who can be very, maybe in the earlier stage even more. But I'm looking at now more of let's say product market fit stage.
Yeah, I think. But if you look at it historically, so on a timeline, then obviously the first funds using EU money fueling into startups were a lot less successful in finding any. And they found better ways of, to use that money. But then, as time progressed, I think the environment, the legal environment, and the criteria for these funds changed continuously. If I look at the last couple of years in Hungary, I can see amazingly good progress on the use of EU funds turned into venture capital money. I think. If I can name names, I think High Ventures did fantastic progress in the last 2 years. So when they started, it was a steep learning curve for everybody. But I think month after month, I have many projects that I work with or that I know of that work with them, and I see huge progress on that. The latest round of Jeremy funds, I was very skeptical, but I can see investments which are making sense, and investment managers who are actually helping startups. So I see that, maybe it's a learning curve for the use of EU funds as well, but it's getting better. Do I think that it's better than private money and it's better than Gyula? No, I don't think so. I think exited entrepreneurs have a lot more to give in many sense. I think the use of public funds is getting much, much better as well. And I think it's just a question of time. An overnight success in Eastern Europe is 10 years minimum. So I think it's just a question of all of these companies getting to the size and growing up to be big enough to be picked up. And I'm just hoping that we've seen a number of exits in the last couple of years. Euroventures had a bunch of exits, but all of them were relatively early exits. And I'm just hoping that we will see some huge exits as well. But that also takes the founders to stick around long enough and not to sell at the first potential offer. So I hope that we will see some of that as well. Founders growing some courage.
Can I add to that? At WhatsApp, being so reliant on EU fund, of course, what you said is a very good phenomenon that we are getting smarter and smarter, also in Poland, in using EU funds for stimulating growth of new companies. But let's think about the future. I mean, with Brexit coming, right? With everybody knows what the political stage in Poland, in Hungary is like right now. We don't know if we are going to have that many European Union funds after Horizon 2020 and later on. So the question is, how can we make the whole venture capital scene and funds more independent of EU funds and Jeremys and so on, right? This is a very vital thing to address, because we would like to see in 2025, for instance, that 80% of venture capital funds here have absolutely no EU funds and can sustain their living and still keep investing.
I'm a contrarian when it comes to private versus public funds. I had people very politely call me an idiot for doing an all-private money fund. Why miss out on Forex free leverage? Why do that? I do it because I don't want to have a bias where I keep investing into businesses that have a 2-3x potential maximum, thinking that it's going to be fine because for me it's 8 or 12x, and it's fine because I have this leverage from public funds. Yeah, it's a non-equity grant, but we're going to price the round in ways so I get the full equity, and we're going to move your headquarters to, I don't know, this village in Eastern Hungary so I can give you the full amount. Yeah, right? You only need a room there. So here's the thing. One thing that a startup has over a big company, and trust me, I know this, is speed and the ability to execute without a lot of overhead, without many, approval cycles and a lot of administration and paperwork around everything. And this is one of the big reasons why you need private funds. Sure, you still have a board to oversee you still have shareholders, you still have fiduciary duty, but you need the ability to execute. And also you need investors who have a vested interest in you going big. And when I say big, I mean really big. Because if you talk about wanting to be successful on a global scale, then you need to act like a company who means to be successful at a global scale. That means getting out there. That means being in your target markets. As I think about it, all the investments I've made so far, they have actual presence in either the US or Germany and the UK. And there is a reason for that. These are large markets, and they got the courage and the talent to execute there. So I'm actually trying to find and grow companies who can surpass my success. And I think my way to do that is actually better suited by using private money.
Thanks for sharing this. Maybe one last question around fundraising. We talked about yesterday during the dinner when preparing for this panel that the best startups actually go right away to Y Combinator or other top-tier VCs. Like, will we have enough good quality startups here to use all these resources?
I wouldn't say that all of the good startups go to 500 startups. What I see is many of the best startups I work with, they might not even, they didn't know that they were a startup when we started talking. They just thought that they are, like one of the examples I have is Logischool. They just thought that they are building a franchise for teaching kids programming. They didn't go to Y Combinator 500 startups. They wouldn't have qualified. They are not an American-style startup in that sense. But can they go stellar? Can they reach their goal of teaching 1 million kids programming at the same time and grow a company value of billions of dollars? I'm sure they can. But I'm a bit different. I have a bit of difference of opinion with Gyula on this. But I think there's something like an Eastern European success story and there's something like an American success story. And I think both of them can happen and both of them work. They just work differently. So I don't think that the American funding schemes and highway is the only way to take.
I think I'm in the middle between literally and what I think about this. I think Gyula articulated very well of what you want from an investor, right? And Y Combinator and 500 Startups is no different than any other investor. They balance their values towards the network and know-how rather than on the money. And I don't, like the most successful startups I know and heard of have not gone through any kind of acceleration. So definitely when you're out of university, you do, and these, like Y Combinator is, Stanford, Harvard, all of these grad students come in, do something cool, we'll give you the network, get you the investor and do something with it. It's when you're in different stages, you need different things with your startup. And I don't think having great accelerators is a one-fit-all solution for all startups at all. You can acquire that knowledge or network in very, very different ways. Not to mention, even if you look at Y Combinator, there's a huge bias towards U.S. companies. I'm not saying it's a deliberate bias. It might be an unknown bias. I'm always joking when and this is a little bit controversial, but when we're looking at diversity and everybody in the U.S. about being diversity, I've been in the U.S. and I've been Eastern European. And whew, I did have discrimination for being Eastern European. So it's, yeah, I don't look at incubators and accelerators as something that is a requirement inside of an ecosystem. You can solve that challenge and the support in very, very different ways.
I mean, for the record, I did not go through an accelerator, but I did end up in Silicon Valley very soon after we were founded. I think either way can work. With that said, for instance, we do have investment in one Y Combinator company, Bitrise, and it's very apparent that when you are a Y Combinator alumni, people are more willing to talk to you. Investors, big potential customers, like it carries a lot of weight with it. I'm sure 500 startups and the other better ones are the same. So if you were a company asking me whether you should go, I would say, yeah, I don't see much harm in it. It's probably better to go than not to go if you can. And you know, that's not even mentioning all the learnings and all the connections you can build. So I think the better accelerators are probably more beneficial than not.
Yeah. From a startup perspective, as with Publishdrive, we went through accelerators. So especially after Google Launchpad, a lot of investors reached out to us because they wanted to get to know us, because they've seen that we were part of the Google Launchpad program. And they were curious what we are doing and how we actually are moving forward. And even, like the big guys who we thought that like Excel, they were reaching out to us. We said, okay, this is not the right time to talk, at least because we are still very small. But we try to keep those networks basically warm and try to keep the conversation going. And that's what and I think that's one of the key things of an accelerator, to open some doors for you, especially if they have a brand name, because it's basically a brand. So what they are using, and they are using it for the sake of the startups who actually can live with that and who can use that kind of brand name.
Maybe I'd like to swim to another voter and talk a little bit about a slightly less interesting and more boring topic, but legal structures and legal environments shape the business environment. How can startups and the stakeholders in the startup ecosystem unite and kind of push policymakers to do changes that are beneficial for them? Maybe, Julia, you could start, since you're doing a lot of work on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. So the policies around us and the legal framework defines what we can and cannot do and how much we have to pay for that. And also the stability or predictability of the law is something very important. So from the Polish perspective, you know, the more the regulations in Poland are perceived internationally as unstable, and they are, let's not fool ourselves, the less investment is flowing in from abroad. The less eagerly investors from abroad, but also startup founders or investors domestically, are thinking about building and growing their companies in Poland. Because if you don't know how much tax you're going to pay tomorrow, then it means you cannot really account for that in your budget, right? So this is one thing, like stability, or taking care of the stability and predictability of regulations is very important. But then when it comes to types of regulations, you know, obviously you have taxes. One thing that we were very much involved with in Poland as Startup Poland was removing the double taxation on venture capital funds. This has been achieved, I would say, 60%, so we are not satisfied yet. It's taken like 3 or 4 years. So it is a very long game to play. But the thing is that in Poland, you know, at the beginning, 5 years ago, anybody who would put their money into a venture capital firm would be taxed twice after cashing out, like on the return and then after cashing out. So it is not something that incentivizes or motivates private LPs to invest in venture capital funds. Another thing is, like, whenever you have a new technology, take blockchain, right, or tokens, and you don't know, and it's completely unregulated by your state, you are not willing to take the risk of building on that technology, or you are willing, but you know that this might end up very badly for you. So in Poland, we've seen that most of the blockchain companies like Golem or Neufund, they have built their companies, and they're very successful in the countries that have had even restrictive regulation when it comes to tokens. I'm talking Switzerland and the Zug, the crypto valley in Zug, basically. So the law around the new technology niches is also very important. Also take, for instance, e-privacy and data protection, so things that were more imposed by the European Union legislative ideas. I sometimes feel like European Commission, like the people who work in Brussels are paid for thinking of new regulations just for the sake of designing new regulations. Right now we have this copyright directive which will be implemented in every member country in 2 years. But this will impose filtering mechanisms on everybody, every company that accepts user-generated content. Of course, this opens up the whole new technology niche. So if you want to build a content filtering startup, the time is now. It's going to be hot in 2 years. But this also means that for the ones who are having user-generated content, there is additional extra risk, liability, that they have to account for in their business plan or budget. And also investors will be less eager or will negotiate harder when it comes to startups that have UGC. So the thing is that regulations always influence us as entrepreneurs. And I see that very often startup founders, especially in Central Eastern Europe, think that the grass is greener on the other side of the Atlantic, and that this is where you can do everything. It's liberal, and nobody's gonna shut down your business or make you pay taxes for anything. But that is not really true, because in the States, all the costs that you would be embedded as the cost of being legally compliant, these are the costs of the fees of the lawyers that could be even much higher than here. So you always have to pay for being legally compliant. And it's absolutely, even though the topic is not sexy, it's boring, all these bills are like hell to read, it's completely illegible, but it is important also to know what is being planned and what kind of rules will be imposed on you in a year or so.
Since we are running out of time, I have a last question, and I would like to ask a very short answer from each of you. A couple of years ago, we've been talking about what is going to be the next Silicon Valley in the region, and I am very happy that question is not anymore on the agenda, since I think it's pretty dumb to compare our region or our ecosystems to Silicon Valley, and we have to find our unique strengths. What do you think? What is the unique strength of Hungary or the CE region, in a few words?
I think one of the biggest positive I see in the Central European region is that with the fall of communism, we are a generation of people, or we are countries of people who learn that rules don't stay around forever. So I think the Central European mindset is a bit more flexible regarding regulations and rules, which is great for innovation, because we think the world will change and we don't believe in everything lasting forever. It must be a lot harder to innovate in Japan or in Switzerland. So I'm grateful for that.
I don't know if we have the strength, but I believe we should have it, and that is probably localization. I think, especially in European startups, they underrate themselves compared to their US counterparts, how successful they can be. And as there are always new and new emerging markets, that could be, or that should be something I believe that we excel in, because from day one, we should build our products thinking about localization, while in the US, they are blinded by the size of the US market. And especially when looking at Africa as a growing, or even Asia as a very, very strong and dynamic market, I think I would assume that is one of our strengths compared to other regions.
I'm not sure if the flexible interpretation of rules is unique to Eastern Europe, like ask Facebook, for instance. But I do think there is a big strength, which is also our weakness, which is being used to having very little resources and being forced to be creative with problem solving. Like in a startup where you can, solve a lot of problems on a tight budget, it's a big advantage in the beginning. Later on, it becomes a disadvantage because let's say you raise funds and your US competitor also raises funds and you're trying to remain cash flow positive, you're trying to optimize every little thing, whereas they are throwing money in the business, into marketing, into sales, and they are expanding, while you are still optimizing your expenses. So it can backfire. We had the same problem, and it caused me a lot of headache, where even with tens of millions of dollars in the bank, my guys were trying to run 3 applications in parallel on the servers just because they were using different resources. It was not optimal at that point. So that's something we need to improve, I think.
I think talent is really one of our strengths as well, because whatever country I visit, I always meet other people, and then many Hungarians, they think that they are not as talented as they could be with if they are competing with other people in other countries, and I think it's not true. So talent is definitely here when it's about how to solve problems, how to create products as well. The weakness what we have is more on the sales side, as we discussed it before as well. And when it's about what other strengths we have is definitely the global aspect. In our case as well, all the influencers we are working with, they are really happy that we always think globally and we are not just US focused. So we don't leave the other people in the UK or in other countries. When we are actually releasing a new product, we always think with their mindset as well and with those customers who we have in the UK or other markets also.
Donut is killing me with his eyes. We are running out. Please.
I'm just going to second Kinga's thing. The talents, according to some estimates, 6% of the global engineering population lives in Central Eastern Europe. So it's a lot because we are not 6% in terms of population and surface in general. And specifically, artificial intelligence skill sets, not the data, but the skill sets, that is something that we should be very proud of here. There's a lot of people who know about that in the region.
Maybe one more thing to add. I think one of the strengths of the region is the proximity between the cities and the markets. And I think Poland and Hungary and other neighboring countries should work more often together. So thank you so much, Julia, and thank you for all the panelists for making up here. I think it was an interesting and important discussion. And I'd like to ask the 2 sharks, Peter and Gyula, to stay on stage because we're going to have probably one of the most exciting programs during Smart, but I will leave that up to Donut to explain. Thank you again for coming.
Let's give a big hands to the guys. Ladies and gents.